In 1324, a man left West Africa on a pilgrimage to Mecca. He brought with him 60,000 people, 500 personal servants, each carrying a 6-pound staff of pure gold, 100 camels, each loaded with 300 pounds of gold dust. And when he arrived in Cairo, he spent so freely, so casually, so completely without concern, that he single-handedly crashed the Egyptian economy. Gold lost a quarter of its value across the entire Mediterranean. It took 12 years to recover. One man, one journey, one economic catastrophe caused entirely by generosity. His name was Mansa Musa, and he was, by any historical measure, the wealthiest human being who has ever lived. This is his story. To understand Mansa Musa, you need to understand the world he was born into. The year is approximately 1280. In Europe, the medieval period is at its height. Kings are fighting over scraps of land. The Black Death hasn't arrived yet, but famine and war are constant companions. The great cathedrals are being built, but most of the population lives in poverty. In the Islamic world, Cairo, Baghdad, Timbuktu, scholarship, medicine, mathematics, and trade are thriving. And in West Africa, something extraordinary is happening. The Mali Empire, stretching across modern-day Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Niger, and Mauritania, is sitting on top of the largest gold deposits in the known world. And nobody in Europe has any idea. The Mali Empire was not a primitive kingdom. It was a sophisticated, literate, economically complex state that controlled the most important trade routes in Africa. It had been founded by Sundiata Keita in 1235, a warrior king whose story is so extraordinary it became the basis for the oral epic called the Sundiata, still recited by West African griots today. Some historians believe it partially inspired the Lion King, but Sundiata's real legacy was economic. He unified the gold fields of West Africa under a single administration. The empire controlled three things the medieval world desperately needed: gold, salt, and the trade routes connecting them. Gold came from mines in the south. Salt, equally valuable, essential for preserving food, came from massive deposits in the Sahara. The Mali Empire sat exactly in the middle and taxed everything passing through. In the medieval world, gold and salt were not just commodities. They were power. Gold backed currencies, funded armies, built palaces and mosques, determined which kingdoms rose and which ones fell. Salt preserved food in a world without refrigeration. In some regions, it was literally worth its weight in gold. The Mali Empire had both in quantities that were almost incomprehensible to the outside world. The gold fields of Bambouk and Beret produced such extraordinary amounts that Mali alone accounted for roughly half of the entire world's gold supply at its peak. Read that again. Half of all the gold in the known world came from the Mali Empire. And the emperor of that empire collected taxes on every single gram that left his territory. This is the economy Mansa Musa inherited, and he multiplied it. Mansa Musa, whose full name was Musa Keita I, was born around 1280. Mansa means emperor or sultan in the Mandinka language. He was not the obvious heir to the throne. He came to power in an unusual way. He was appointed deputy to the previous emperor, Abu Bakr II, while Abu Bakr pursued one of history's most ambitious and mysterious expeditions. Abu Bakr II was convinced there was land beyond the Atlantic Ocean. He assembled a fleet of 2,000 canoes and sailed west into the Atlantic to find it. He was never seen again. No one knows what happened. Whether he found land, whether his fleet was destroyed by storms, whether he reached the Americas before Columbus, it remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. Musa, waiting at home, became emperor. Mansa Musa took the throne of Mali around 1312. What he inherited was already extraordinary. The wealthiest empire in Africa, controlling the gold and salt trade, with a sophisticated administrative system and a military capable of projecting power across an enormous territory. What he did with it was unprecedented. He expanded the empire significantly, adding the trading cities of Timbuktu and Gao to Mali's territory. He strengthened the administrative system, appointing governors to manage distant provinces. He invested massively in Islamic scholarship, building mosques, funding schools, establishing libraries. And he was deeply, genuinely devout. As a Muslim emperor, he was obligated to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in his lifetime if he was capable of doing so. Mansa Musa was very capable. The question was, how do you make the Hajj when you are the richest man in the world? Apparently, you bring all of it with you. The Hajj pilgrimage from Mali to Mecca covers roughly 4,000 miles each way, across the Sahara, through Egypt, down the Red Sea coast, into the Arabian Peninsula. For an ordinary person, a brutal, potentially fatal journey. For Mansa Musa, a royal procession that would become the most famous journey in medieval history. The preparation alone took years. He assembled a retinue of 60,000 people, 12,000 personal servants dressed in brocade and Persian silk, 500 servants designated to walk directly ahead of him, each carrying a 6-pound staff of solid gold. Soldiers, administrators, doctors, scholars, entertainers, 80 to 100 camels, each carrying between 50 and 300 pounds of gold dust. He also brought his senior wife, Inari Cunate, with her own retinue of 500 personal servants. The caravan stretched so far across the desert that those at the front could not see those at the back. The caravan set out from the Mali capital, likely Niamey, and headed northeast across the Sahara. The Sahara crossing alone was extraordinary. The caravan would have needed enormous quantities of food and water for 60,000 people and thousands of animals, sustained across hundreds of miles of desert where nothing grows. Logistics of this scale in the 14th century required sophisticated planning that rivaled anything happening in Europe at the time. Wells were located in advance. Food was carried or purchased along the route. Local populations along the way were compensated generously. And everywhere the caravan stopped, Mansa Musa gave. He distributed gold to the poor along the route. He funded the construction of mosques in towns that lacked them. He paid generously for every service rendered. He was not performing generosity. For Mansa Musa, it was simply the natural expression of having more wealth than any one person could ever need. When the caravan arrived in Cairo in 1324, the city was not prepared. Cairo was already one of the great cities of the medieval world, the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, a major center of Islamic scholarship and trade. Its rulers had seen wealthy visitors before. They had never seen anything like this. The Egyptian sources that survived described the caravan's arrival with barely concealed astonishment. Al-Amari, an Arab scholar who visited Cairo 12 years after Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, recorded testimonies from Egyptians who were still talking about it. He described Mansa Musa arriving with such extraordinary wealth that his mere presence disrupted the Egyptian economy. The Sultan of Egypt, Al-Nasir Muhammad, sent officials to greet the Mali emperor and escort him to the city. What followed was a diplomatic encounter that revealed everything about how Mansa Musa saw himself and how he expected others to see him. When Mansa Musa was brought before the Sultan of Egypt, a problem immediately arose. Egyptian royal protocol required all visitors to prostrate themselves, to bow to the ground before the Sultan. Mansa Musa refused. He was an emperor. He bowed to no one except Allah. The standoff was diplomatically tense. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Mansa Musa would bow, but declare it was a bow to God, not to the Sultan. This moment tells you everything about who Mansa Musa was. He had traveled 2,000 miles through desert. He was a guest in a foreign ruler's court. The diplomatic pressure to simply comply was enormous. He didn't. He was courteous. He was generous. He showered the Egyptian court with gifts of extraordinary value. But he did not diminish himself. He was the emperor of Mali. He knew exactly who he was. And then Mansa Musa began spending. He spent in Cairo for 3 months. He gave gold to the poor in the streets. He bought goods at whatever price was asked, never negotiating, never questioning. He commissioned gifts for Egyptian officials, scholars, and religious figures. His followers did the same, 12,000 servants, soldiers, and attendants, all spending freely in Cairo's markets. The effect on Cairo's economy was immediate and devastating. Gold, the basis of medieval currency, was suddenly everywhere. When supply of any commodity floods a market, its value drops. Gold lost approximately 25% of its value across Egypt and the wider Mediterranean region. Prices for ordinary goods skyrocketed as gold became worth less. Merchants who had hoarded gold saw their wealth evaporate. The Egyptian economy took 12 years to fully recover. One man's generosity, completely unintentional, caused an economic crisis across an entire region. While in Cairo, Mansa Musa met Egyptian scholars, architects, and intellectuals. He was particularly taken with an Andalusian poet and architect named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. He invited him to return to Mali. Al-Sahili accepted, reportedly in exchange for an enormous gift of gold. This meeting would transform West African architecture forever. Back in Mali, Al-Sahili introduced new building techniques, using burnt brick instead of mud brick, creating distinctive architectural styles that blended North African and West African traditions. The most famous result was the Jingareber Mosque in Timbuktu, still standing today, still in use after 7 centuries. But Mansa Musa's investment in Timbuktu went far beyond architecture. He made it a center of Islamic scholarship that would eventually house one of the greatest libraries in the medieval world, the Sankor Madrasa, containing an estimated 700,000 manuscripts. From Cairo, the caravan continued northeast, through the Sinai Peninsula, down the coast of the Red Sea, into the Hijaz region of the Arabian Peninsula. When Mansa Musa arrived in Mecca, he had completed the Hajj. For a devout Muslim, this was the fulfillment of one of the 5 pillars of Islam, a moment of profound spiritual significance. But the practical impact of his arrival in Mecca echoed across the Islamic world. Word of the Mali emperor had preceded him. Scholars, merchants, and rulers across the Middle East now knew that somewhere in West Africa, there was an empire of almost incomprehensible wealth and a ruler of genuine piety, learning, and dignity. The Islamic world began to look west in a new way, and Mansa Musa, having completed his religious obligation, turned his caravan around and headed home, with one significant stop on the way back. The return journey revealed something that even Mansa Musa's extraordinary resources had not anticipated. He had spent too much. Not in the sense of personal bankruptcy. The Mali Empire's gold fields were still producing enormous quantities, but the physical gold he had brought on the journey was running low. To fund the return trip, Mansa Musa was forced to borrow money, at interest, from merchants in Cairo. The richest man in the world, borrowing money to get home. He repaid the loans in full upon returning to Mali, and reportedly at generous rates. But the incident illustrates something important. Even wealth of this magnitude has limits when removed from the system that generates it. The gold fields of Mali were the source. The caravan was just a river running from that source. And rivers, taken too far from their origin, eventually run dry. Mansa Musa returned to Mali around 1325. He brought back with him scholars, architects, poets, and religious teachers from Cairo, Mecca, and the wider Islamic world. He immediately launched an extraordinary building program, a royal palace in his capital, the Jingareber Mosque in Timbuktu, designed by Al-Sahili, the Sankor Mosque, which would become the center of the great university, mosques in Gao, in Niani, across the empire. He also continued expanding Mali's territory, his generals pushing the empire's borders further into the Sahara and deeper into the savannah. Trade intensified. Caravans crossing the Sahara brought North African and Middle Eastern goods into Mali while carrying gold and salt out. Timbuktu transformed from a significant trading city into one of the intellectual capitals of the entire medieval world. Scholars came from Egypt, from Morocco, from Andalusia. The university at Sankor eventually enrolled 25,000 students. At its peak under Mansa Musa, Timbuktu was extraordinary. Population of approximately 100,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. 3 great mosques, Jingareber, Sankor, and Sidi Yahya, a university system enrolling tens of thousands of students studying Islamic law, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, history, and rhetoric. A book trade so active that manuscripts were among the most valuable commodities in the city, in some accounts, more valuable than gold. Scholars from across the Islamic world competed for positions at Timbuktu's institutions. The city produced jurists, physicians, astronomers, and mathematicians whose work influenced scholarship across Africa and the Middle East. This was not a remote backwater. This was a global intellectual center, funded, built, and sustained by Mansa Musa's vision and resources. And almost nobody in Europe had any idea it existed. Here is the moment when the outside world truly woke up to Mansa Musa. In 1375, 50 years after his pilgrimage, a major king cartographer named Abraham Crest produced the Catalan Atlas, one of the most important maps of the medieval world. In the center of West Africa, on the map, sits a figure on a golden throne. He is holding a golden scepter in one hand and a golden orb in the other. The inscription next to him reads, in Catalan, that this lord is the richest and most noble king in all the land, due to the abundance of gold that is found in his country. This image of Mansa Musa, drawn 50 years after his death by a European cartographer who had never visited Africa, became the dominant image of sub-Saharan Africa in European consciousness for centuries. The richest man in the world, finally visible to the world that hadn't known he existed. Every article about Mansa Musa eventually tries to answer the same question. How rich was he, in modern terms? The honest answer is, we don't fully know, and the estimates vary wildly. Some financial historians have suggested a figure of $400 billion in modern terms. Others go higher. One frequently cited estimate reaches $400 trillion. These numbers are essentially meaningless because wealth of this type cannot be directly converted across 7 centuries of economic change. But here is what we can say with confidence. He controlled approximately half the world's gold supply at its peak. He could spend so freely in Cairo that he crashed the regional economy and felt no meaningful personal impact. He borrowed money on the return journey and repaid it as a minor inconvenience. He funded the construction of mosques, universities, and palaces simultaneously across an empire the size of Western Europe. By any measure, he was in a category of wealth that has no modern equivalent. Mansa Musa was not just wealthy. He was a sophisticated administrator. The Mali Empire under his rule was governed through a system of provinces, each administered by a governor appointed by the emperor. He maintained a professional army, cavalry armed with iron weapons, infantry, and siege capabilities. He established a system of justice based on Islamic law, administered by trained judges called qadis. He personally heard appeals and dispensed justice, a tradition of the Mali emperors going back to Sundiata. Trade was regulated and taxed efficiently. Every caravan crossing Mali's territory paid duties on its goods. The postal and communication system allowed messages to travel rapidly across the empire. And he maintained diplomatic relationships with the rulers of North Africa, the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, and the Islamic states of the Middle East. This was not a kingdom running on luck. It was a state run with precision. Mali's military under Mansa Musa was formidable. His army is estimated to have numbered in the tens of thousands: cavalry, infantry, and specialist units. The cavalry were particularly feared, mounted warriors armed with iron lances and protected by armor, capable of rapid movement across the savannah. During his reign, Mali's generals, particularly a commander named Saran Mandian, pushed the empire's borders significantly. The capture of Timbuktu and Gao early in his reign were military achievements that doubled Mali's access to trans-Saharan trade routes. Mali also conducted campaigns against the Mossi kingdoms to the south and maintained military pressure on potential rivals to the north. But Mansa Musa preferred projection of power through wealth and diplomacy over constant warfare. Why fight when you can simply outspend every potential enemy? His gold was as effective a deterrent as any army. Mansa Musa's Islam was genuine, not performative. He prayed. He fasted. He funded religious education. He built mosques not just as political statements, but as expressions of sincere faith. But he also navigated a complex reality. Many of his subjects were not Muslim. Traditional African religious practices remained widespread across the empire. Mansa Musa did not force conversion. He funded Islamic institutions and promoted Islamic scholarship at the elite level, among administrators, scholars, and traders. But he allowed traditional practices to continue among ordinary people. This pragmatic approach to religion was part of what made the Mali Empire so stable. A ruler who tries to force religious change typically encounters resistance, rebellion, and instability. Mansa Musa understood that an empire held together by commerce and administration was more durable than one held together by ideology. His faith was his own. His governance was for everyone. Perhaps Mansa Musa's most enduring legacy was not gold. It was paper. The libraries of Timbuktu, funded, built, and sustained during and after his reign, eventually housed an estimated 700,000 to 1 million manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, Islamic law, history, poetry, philosophy, written in Arabic, in Tamashek, in Songhai, and in other regional languages. These were not copies of works from elsewhere. Many were original scholarship, produced in Timbuktu by West African scholars making original contributions to human knowledge. When European colonizers arrived in West Africa centuries later, many assumed they were encountering people without a written intellectual tradition. The manuscripts proved otherwise. Today, approximately 300,000 of these manuscripts survive, housed in private family collections in the Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu. Scholars are still working to digitize and translate them. Mansa Musa built a civilization that was writing books while Europe was still burning them. Mansa Musa died around 1337. He had ruled for approximately 25 years. The empire he left behind was at its absolute peak, territorially vast, economically dominant, intellectually thriving. But empires built around exceptional individuals are always vulnerable when that individual is gone. His son Magan succeeded him, and almost immediately the cracks appeared. Magan was a weaker ruler. The discipline that Mansa Musa had imposed on the empire's administration began to loosen. Raids from the Mossi kingdoms to the south increased. The Tuareg people of the Sahara, previously kept in check by Mali's military power, became increasingly aggressive. Timbuktu was sacked by Mossi raiders during Magan's reign. The gold trade continued, but the empire's ability to tax and protect it was weakening. The Mali Empire would continue for another century and a half, but it would never again reach the heights of Mansa Musa's reign. The Mali Empire's decline came from multiple directions simultaneously. Internal, succession disputes weakened central authority. Strong governors became effectively independent rulers. The administrative system that Mansa Musa had built required a strong emperor to function. Without one, it fragmented. External, the Songhai Empire to the east grew increasingly powerful, eventually absorbing Mali's eastern territories, including Timbuktu and Gao. Environmental, droughts affected agricultural production and disrupted the trade routes that were Mali's economic lifeline. And then came something nobody in Mali had anticipated: the Portuguese. In the mid-15th century, Portuguese explorers began sailing down the West African coast, eventually finding sea routes to the gold fields that had made Mali wealthy. The trans-Saharan trade routes that Mali controlled were bypassed. Gold could now move by sea, without crossing Mali's territory, without paying Mali's taxes. The economic foundation of the empire was undermined not by war, but by geography. As the Mali Empire declined, something strange happened to Mansa Musa's memory in Europe. He became a myth. The image from the Catalan Atlas, the golden king on his throne, persisted in European imagination long after accurate knowledge of West Africa faded. Timbuktu transformed from a real city of scholars and merchants into a legendary place of impossible wealth and mystery. European explorers competed to be the first to reach it, convinced that the city of gold must still exist somewhere in the African interior. When the Scottish explorer Gordon Lang finally reached Timbuktu in 1826 and the French explorer René Caillie arrived in 1828, they found a real city, still significant, still inhabited, but a fraction of its medieval glory. The legend had been greater than the reality, but the reality had been extraordinary enough. For centuries, Mansa Musa was known only to specialists in medieval African history. Then the internet arrived. A 2012 Celebrity Net Worth article attempted to calculate the wealthiest people in history and placed Mansa Musa at the top, with an estimated wealth of $400 billion. The article went viral. Suddenly, millions of people were searching for a name they had never heard in school. Who was Mansa Musa? Why hadn't they learned about him? The questions were legitimate. The story of the Mali Empire, one of medieval history's most sophisticated and wealthy civilizations, is almost entirely absent from standard Western history education. The rediscovery of Mansa Musa in popular culture prompted a wider conversation about which histories get told, which get ignored, and why. That conversation is still ongoing, and it led directly to renewed academic and public interest in the manuscripts of Timbuktu, the archaeology of the Mali Empire, and the broader history of medieval African civilizations. In Mali today, Mansa Musa is a national hero. The Jingareber Mosque he funded still stands in Timbuktu, still in use after 7 centuries. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The manuscript collections he helped establish still exist, damaged by time, conflict, and a devastating attack by Islamist militants in 2012 who destroyed several irreplaceable documents, but still largely intact. West African oral tradition, maintained by griots, the hereditary storytellers who preserve history through performance, kept Mansa Musa's memory alive through centuries when written records were inaccessible or lost. His name has become synonymous with wealth, generosity, and the sophistication of medieval African civilization. Streets, schools, and public buildings across West Africa bear his name. But his most important legacy is what his story does to the historical narrative that Africa had no significant pre-colonial civilizations. His story doesn't just challenge that narrative, it destroys it completely. For centuries, the dominant narrative in Western education was essentially this. Africa, before European contact, was a continent of primitive tribes without writing, without cities, without complex governance. Mansa Musa is one of many pieces of evidence that this narrative was not history. It was politics. The Mali Empire had cities larger than most European capitals. It had universities operating centuries before Oxford was founded. It had a manuscript tradition producing original scholarship in mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. It had administrative systems, legal codes, diplomatic relationships, and military capabilities that rivaled anything in the medieval world. The erasure of this history from Western education was not accidental. It served a purpose, making the colonization of Africa seem like the introduction of civilization to people who had none. The true history of medieval Africa, of Mali, of Kush, of Aksum, of Great Zimbabwe, tells a completely different story. Mansa Musa is the most famous chapter, but there are many more. Let us take a full measure of Mansa Musa. He inherited an already wealthy empire and expanded it territorially, economically, and intellectually. He completed the Hajj in a manner that announced the Mali Empire to the entire Islamic world and permanently changed how West Africa was perceived internationally. He brought back scholars and architects who transformed Timbuktu into a global intellectual center. He funded the construction of mosques and universities that operated for centuries after his death. He governed with sophistication, balancing religious promotion with practical tolerance, military strength with diplomatic preference. He was generous to a degree that accidentally crashed an economy, and borrowed money to get home without apparent embarrassment, because borrowing was simply practical and repayment was simply honor. He built a civilization that was writing books, training doctors, and teaching mathematics while much of Europe struggled through the medieval period. And he did it all in a part of the world that the dominant historical narrative would later pretend had contributed nothing to human civilization.